folks who are joining us via Zoom, our virtual participants and live participants. We're so glad you're here today. We are going to start our afternoon session focusing on stress, COVID-19, resilience, families, communities, and suicide prevention. But first, what I need you to do is help us log your participation using the Google Doc that can be reached using this QR code that you see on the screen. And the session that you'll see that you want to enter your information for is labeled suicide once you scan that code. So for both our live participants and our virtual live participants, if you would do that for us, please. And we'll pull it up again, y'all. But thank you so much for getting us off to a good start. Again, I'm Dr. Angela Griffin, your psychology program director. So glad that you're here with us to learn some fantastic information from two wonderful speakers. We're going to start today with Dr. Shauna Cooper, and then we will hear from Dr. Peter Warren. I'm going to start with introductions first, however. So let's go back out to our participants. You know what? Thank y'all. I was wondering where everybody was. Good afternoon again. So for the third time, let me welcome you to our wonderful afternoon session focused on stress, COVID-19, coping, resilience, families, communities, and suicide prevention. I'm Dr. Angela Griffin, your psychology program director. We're having some tech issues, but we're so glad you're patient here with us. I'm going to share one more time, y'all, now that we've got the video here. The QR code that I would ask you at home, virtually, and here with us live to scan and log your participation. It will take you to a Google Doc. You want to enter your information for the session labeled suicide. All right. So again, welcome, good afternoon, everyone here with us on Airport Campus at MDC and those joining us virtually. We're so glad that you're here. We are going to start today with introductions for our two wonderful speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Shauna Cooper, and she is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience, director of the Strengths, Assets, and Resilience, the STAR Lab, at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, go Heels. Okay, I'm an alumna too. Currently, she's an equity fellow at the Urban Institute. Dr. Cooper received her PhD in developmental psychology from the University of Michigan. After 9 years as an assistant and associate professor at the Department of Psychology at the University of South Carolina, Dr. Cooper joined UNC's developmental psychology area in 2017. Broadly, her areas of expertise include family, how family, school, and community contexts shape development and well-being. Dr. Cooper's contributions span several areas, including the racial and cultural context of parenting, father involvement, girls' health and well-being, and community level risk and protective factors. So I'm going to turn things over to our fantastic Dr. Cooper, who's joining us again for her second Get Psyched, and let her share some of her expertise with you. So Dr. Cooper, you are now our host.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, and happy to be with you virtually. And, I like to see faces. So, those of you who are in person in the room, I will try to soak up as much of your energy as possible, virtually. So today I'm just going to quickly give some thoughts and really talk about the broader sort of mental health landscape, well-being landscape for children and families, and then also talk about perspectives on family and community resilience and adaptation. So I do use the word resilience. It's part of my lab name at UNC Chapel Hill. I actually do prefer the word adaptation. I will talk about why that is so within the next 15 minutes that I'm with you. So let me go ahead and share my screen and begin. Okay. Let me know if you cannot see the screen, but I think everybody should be able to see the screen. So again, I am happy to share some thoughts and some of my work. I do a mixture of, traditional research talk with also just some real life application discussion of how these things unfold for our lives every day. And, as a psychologist, scholar, researcher, however I, whatever space I'm in, whatever descriptive I'm using, at the end of the day, our research in our labs, the research that we publish is important, but it is important to the extent that it reflects life as it is lived. So today I will quickly hit on some of the sort of these broader points. So 4 key focus areas, rooting us in the broader landscape of youth mental health and well-being. So what are we seeing right now in relation to understanding youth mental health? Also talking about this more broadly, right? So we know that children are situated in families, in communities, in neighborhoods. And when we talk about youth mental health and well-being, we must also talk about this broader social context that might shape both positive and negative aspects of mental health. So then I will quickly talk about adaptation and resilient processes, and then leave quickly with some ending thoughts. So I wanted to root us today in what we see unfolding from a mental health and well-being perspective. So broader mental health and well-being landscape. And I would like to say, although families, children, adults are still impacted by COVID-19, is that, we may be closing in on sort of the other side. That also is debatable, but what we see on this at this moment in time is that we have seen upticks, increases in anxiety, depression, sleep issues, withdrawal from family, also externalizing behaviors in addition to internalizing behaviors among youth, right? Particularly adolescents and teens. And so those of you who are in this space and are, either, living some of this reality or work in, organizations or spaces where this is part of a broader discussion, there have been a lot of articles, a lot of events that have focused in on understanding, both describing the patterns, but also understanding the nature of this, right? So, what is impacting, or what are the factors that are impacting mental health in this current moment for children and youth, right? We also have seen patterns with respect to certain racial and or ethnic groups. And so, over not just during COVID, but these patterns were long in effect before the COVID pandemic began, but we've seen increased suicide attempts, increased suicide rates for Black youth in particular. And we have data from the 90s all the way up to, current that are showing sort of this increase in suicide rates among this population. So we have sort of this broader landscape, but we also see different things happening for different groups of youth. So again, I wanted to step back from the broader landscape and then also think about what are some of these broader things that might directly and indirectly have implications for well-being of youth, but then again, thinking about that within our family and or community context. So again, we can think about it both in terms of what I consider to be spillover, and simply put, one example that I often use is that our work experiences shape how we may interact at home, right? So the literature suggests and has indicated time and time again that, for example, working in a higher stressed work environment has implications for parents, right? So parents leave work and go home more stressed. That has implications for interactions with children, and those interactions have implications for mental health and well-being, right? So, we're in a moment where spillover may not be the right word. Cascade might be the more appropriate word to use. And so we see a range of things happening that have implications for youth well-being. So economic, financial challenges, housing, not just, certainly in North Carolina, we have had this conversation. South Carolina, I can assume also is having a similar conversation, but the cost of housing, the increase in cost of housing, and what that might mean for families, and what we also know in terms of both indirect and direct links to well-being. Also, within the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen some shifting and loss of social support systems. So a lot of the work that I do have done recently is focused on fathers and how they navigate parenting, their own stressors, whether that be in work context or broader just social stressors. But that 40%, almost 40% of our fathers noted that they have lost social support systems, friends, networks, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. We've also talked about it in terms of how this has complicated families that are non-residential. So whether you're a mother or father, aunt, grandparent, is that in this moment, there's some, complications with respect to visitation, seeing children regularly, which we know can also have implications for children's well-being. So as I set that broader landscape, I wanted to turn to discussion of key adaptive processes. So adaptation and resilience are often used interchangeably. And what are things that in moments of stress can, in some ways provide a buffer for youth or children? So there are, a lot of, I will say it in this way, is that there's variation in terms of what is protective for an individual versus another individual, but there are some sort of broader examples, right? So family routines, relationships, agency and efficacy, identity development, which is really important for youth as they transition into adolescence, but we also see that importance as they transition, as they transition into young adulthood. Coping, how we deal with stress. What are the things that we do when we have a rough day at work or at school, right? Do we call a friend? Do we yell at our sibling? Whatever that thing is, those are all examples of coping, right? We can cope in some ways that are viewed as being a more positive way of coping, but then there's some things that are not as ideal in terms of how we deal with stress. Also social supports and connectedness, which is also another example of coping. So taking a step back from how We talk about it, only as researchers. There are a couple things that parents often ask, right? And so given this moment, I'll give a couple of examples that I do often use, right? So how our caregivers, parents help children manage emotional stress. Not only a result of the COVID-19, but the last 2 years, we've had a lot of discussions around how kids make sense and how they discuss race or understand social inequality, for example. And so I use that as an example of kids pick up on all of that, just like we do as adults. And parents often ask, how do we have these discussions? How do we have these discussions in a way that are developmentally appropriate? I often say honest discussions that are focused on developmental appropriateness, but not shying away from topics that children see and live every day. Also creating opportunities for joy. These are all ways that parents have navigated, certainly within the last 2 to 3 years, 2.5 years, but these things have always been part of how parents help children manage stress and, in many ways preserving or promoting or fostering positive well-being, creating opportunities for joy. Right. So we can see several examples of, during the pandemic where people had drive-through birthday parties, not just for children, but elders in our community. So I can say in that, my community is that there were birthday parties, graduation parties that were drive-by or drive-through, our virtual events, both for children that had important events, so graduating from school, making the honor roll, their birthday, but we also had these same types of events, not necessarily graduation, but celebrating an elder, their birthday, for example. All of those are opportunities to create joy, even in a moment of stress. So some of the other ways when I give talks for the community, parents often talk about social media. And so I put this slide in here for a couple of ways, couple of reasons, just to sort of reflect the broader what we know and what we see happening, and what people are writing about, but also what people are living, right? And so I think that many of us can say is that there has been, or we would assume that there has been an increase in social media use, right? So increased screen time. That also could mean exposure to, things that are viewed as not as ideal for children to see without proper digestion of those events. And we see in the here and now that there's some data that suggests sort of this increase in certain in media use, types of media use, in terms of what that might mean for youth mental health. Parents often, this is one of the first things that they ask about. And, I talk about it in terms of a family sort of adaptation perspective, right? Is that, family establishing boundaries, that can be a media plan. But I also counter that with finding balance to that, right? Meaning that life happens and sometimes we just have to adjust. And in some moments, it may be okay if children are having more screen time, right? So that, so that people can get things done, cook dinner, to take a breath themselves, right? So thinking about these broader discussions, but also what they might mean for everyday interactions and our discussions. And, this is just a continuation of that point, is really that stressful times, sometimes we have to give ourselves grace. And part of that is that we know that, for example, increased social media use, when it replaces sleep, exercise, or other healthy behaviors, can have implications for children. But we also know is that during stressful times, children may watch more television or use their iPad or tablet more. And sometimes we have to give ourselves some grace in sort of negotiating that. So I often say on the other side of things, coping can be a tool for families. And again, as a psychologist, as a researcher, but as a psychologist and researcher who gives a lot of community talks, right? Things that speak to people in terms of how they are interfacing in their everyday, is that we saw in the last 2 to 3 years, several examples of how families cope together in the face of stress, right? And so we've seen much of that on social media. And what is unfolding is that it is a coping tool. It can be a coping tool, right? And, all of the TikTok challenges, all of the Instagram challenges, all of these things that we've seen at a family level. I use the Wilsons, Russell and Sierra as an example of that. But when you look at this, yes, they're dancing and, but it also was in a moment of high stress. And it is an example of how families may cope, right? And that parents often use this as a way to cope together, right? And again, families cope in various ways in response to stress, right? But we can see that sometimes there are opportunities to create family bonding and connection. And what I think most of us would agree on, learning opportunities. And so the broader message of that is that social media, yes, we talk about it in terms of the negative, but we can see examples in our everyday where they have been coping tools for families, and they have been important for how families have navigated in the face of stress, not just for the pandemic, but there are other examples as well. So quickly, as we talk about families, I like to extend it to not just our blood family or our biological family, but our communities, right? And many of us probably on the call today, those that we know, also have family members who are not necessarily related to you biologically, right? So, I often say, how many of us have a play cousin, right? Play cousin meaning it's your cousin, but it's not your cousin, or an aunt and uncle that you've always referred to as an aunt and uncle, but isn't really related to you, right? So these are examples of extended kinship support, but also represents our broader community. So I often use words from when we are doing research with families, whether that is based upon surveys or qualitative data. At the end of the day, how people respond and talk about their experiences, nothing is more powerful than that, right? So at the end of the day, how, for example, our work with fathers, how they talk about their role as not just fathers, but also community, being involved and engaged in the community. So coaching, right? So being a mentor to children that are not necessarily related to them, right? So this is just one quote, right? And this is one of our fathers: "We're not going to let you fail." And he goes on to talk about how children, regardless if they're their children or not, is that once they come into their home, they begin to treat them in the same way that they treat their children. So very quickly, community assets and social support. We know that social support is identified as a cultural coping strategy. We can see that unfold in various ways for children and adults, right? So positive well-being, identity development, engagement in their community, sense of empowerment. Some of our own work looks at that from a gendered perspective. And what we find is that mentors, community mentors, neighborhood support are particularly important for boys. We find that relationships with both mothers and fathers were particularly protective for girls. But thinking about this within the context of mentoring relationships and what we know in terms of being linked to positive mental health outcomes, we can think about that. When we say mentoring, sometimes we think only of formal mentoring, mentors that we get from engaging in community organizations or school or church, whatever. But we also have what I consider to be natural mentors, people that we see, in our communities who are mentoring or providing social support or community support for both children and families. So some of my work also looks at not just children benefiting from mentoring, but also engaging and being leaders in their community. And so I often share this frame is that some of my work looks at how youth, their engagement in their communities and how that is related to their sense of empowerment, and that children who have a greater sense of efficacy, that they believe that they can change the world that they live in, or have more positive well-being, but we also see that those youth are less likely to engage in risk behaviors, right? And I think this speaks to the broader point of empowerment and efficacy being important, but also the importance of accessible community-focused activities for youth and what it means for their well-being and health. So my last point, or one of my last points before I leave you, is really the message of, as we talk about youth well-being and mental health and all the various direct and indirect ways that it may have implications for well-being, center to that is thinking about parents and caregivers. I've given enough community talks where parents have often said is that they are tired, that they are highly stressed, they're navigating multiple things, whether that's multiple multiple jobs, multiple commitments in their communities. They also report the loss of other caregivers in their community. So an older relative who would watch their children can no longer do it, or that they have lost, due to the pandemic, for example, have lost family members who have passed away who provided essential social support. And so we do see we are in a moment where both parents and children are reporting increased stress. So part of that message is really around not ignoring or not acknowledging that stress, and really sort of thinking about parents and caregivers in ways that acknowledge and help manage that stress, because it is a reality. And as part of that, knowing and recognizing limits. I say this time and time again for parents as we talk about youth mental health, parenting does not mean perfection, and that even in and of itself can be stressful for parents, right? Making sure that you do the right thing. And thinking about processing one's own emotions, but also thinking about your own social supports and connection, and finding moments to just reflect and be. And, another point that I've often said as part of this discussion around family and community resilience is really that self-care is not selfish. And, we can't help others if we are not committed to, in some way, shape, or form, our own health and well-being. So I will leave you with, when we talk about resilience, and it looks like I probably skipped a slide somewhere around there, but we can follow up later. Yes. So as I say, part of how I talk about resilience is that we often talk about it as being inherent. People are just resilient. The reason I actually don't like to use the word resilience is because it brings that up. And I use the word adaptation. And an important part of this is really understanding that resilience extends beyond the individual and includes our broader social networks and systems. And it is our response in our environments to challenges and or risks. And resilience resources can be replenished, renewed, but they can also be depleted. And so as I flip to that, the last slide, or the second to last slide, is really resilience. This is a quote from Anne Maston, who is well known for her work with respect to resilience. And I use it as a grounding quote as I leave. Resilience does not come from rare and special qualities, but from the magic, everyday magic of ordinary, normative human resources in children, in their families and relationships, and in their communities. And so as we talk about risks with respect to children, families, communities, we must also talk about strengths and adaptive processes that can promote positive mental health and well-being. And so I think I'm a little closer to time, so I'm not going to go over this, and we can cover in the Q&A, but I do think that one of the important things to keep in mind is that resilience isn't something that just emerges. People, the discussions of people being either resilient or not resilient is that our systems and our policies must support that. Again, thinking about that from a child perspective, but also with respect to families, caregivers, and the broader community. So I will leave you there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Warren. Thank you so much, Dr. Warren. We really, or Dr. Cooper, I apologize. Enjoyed that so much. I learned something new and beneficial from Dr. Cooper every time I hear her speak. So I'm sure that you got that and more. So thank you so much for being with us. We are now going to move to Dr. Peter Warren. I'll do a brief introduction. Zoom is really testing us today, but we're getting a lot for it, y'all. So thank you for hanging in here with us. So appreciate Dr. Cooper and Dr. Warren being here together with us. I'll do a brief introduction and then turn things over to Dr. Peter Warren, who's going to speak with us a bit about stress, coping, COVID-19, and a bit on suicide prevention as well. And then we will move into Q&A. Some of you may need to leave right at time. We will do our best to get to as many questions as possible. And keep in mind that we have this recorded, so this will be available to you after today as well. But be thinking of your questions, my live audience, and those of you who are here with us via Zoom virtually. So briefly, Dr. Peter Warren is the Suicide Prevention Program Director for the Columbia VA Healthcare System here in Columbia, South Carolina, and BSN 7 Suicide Prevention Lead. He received his doctorate in clinical community psychology from the University of South Carolina, and is a board member of the South Carolina chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Dr. Warren's approach to suicide prevention combines applied crisis intervention, systems and quality improvement, and utilizing community partnerships to improve outcomes for at-risk veterans. So I'm going to turn things over to you, Dr. Warren. Thank you so much for being here with us. And looks like you are muted.
No problem. Let me get my, saying I can't share my screen. It says disabled participant screen sharing.
Unmuted. Thank you. Dr. Cooper, are you able to pass the hosting to Dr. Peter Warren, please?
All right.
There we go. Dr. Peter Warren.
All right. The sharing should come up in just a second. Sorry. All right. Can everybody see the slides?
We got it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank goodness. Just a second. All right. So as Angel said, my name is Dr. Peter Warren. I'm the Columbia VA Healthcare System Suicide Prevention Manager. I've been working in and around suicide prevention for probably the better part of 10 years now. This is something that is a big passion of mine. And when you do this long enough, you start to understand that suicide prevention is not necessarily about those really dramatic crisis moments. Quite often, it is really about meeting people where they are. It's about understanding that suicide itself, like Dr. Cooper pointed out earlier, that people have a lot of coping strategies when things happen in their lives that aren't really the way they want. And suicide is really the ultimate maladaptive coping strategy. Suicide is not actually about wanting to die at its core. It's about wanting to be out of pain. It's about wanting to be out of distress. And so one of the most productive ways of attempting to prevent suicide is to identify what is causing people to be stressed out, what is causing people to feel like suicide is the most logical answer in the moment. So most people never consider suicide as a viable way of coping with the stress that they're experiencing in their lives, but some people do. And so suicide is about this narrowing of potential options that a person perceives that they have available to them. And so my training, as Angela pointed out, was in community psychology. So from that, we look at the large scale, the macro system level view of preventing some kind of health concern. And so it's very much a public health kind of approach. It's very much a large societal approach. So from our own view of suicide prevention here in the VA, we take that community psychology approach to it. And so what I'm talking about today is, what do we do to try to keep ourselves healthy? What do we do to try to keep ourselves from getting into a crisis situation to begin with? And obviously, it's no secret. The last 2 years have been some of the most stressful of most of our lives. And so I was talking to my niece, who is 19 right now, and actually in college over in Georgia. And she was talking about how her generation, the Gen Z, I think, as they were, this is their biggest crisis moment for them. This is what they have just kind of grown into adulthood knowing, but it's still stressful for everybody. So we're going to talk a little bit about what makes up stress, what makes up anxiety. And so anxiety, as we all know, is just a normal human emotion. It's very effective in helping us be aware of and respond to threats in our environment. We're kind of hardwired with this sympathetic nervous system alarm, that fight, flight, or freeze response that we all have. Helps us get ready to defend against a threat when it's noticed, or run away from it, or kind of like play possum and hope that we are so unthreatening that the threat ignores us. And this is kind of one of those hardwired instinctual things that all human beings have, much like every other organism on the planet. And when we experience this, again, we're getting back to the basic neuroscience of fear and anxiety and stress here, that our brain sees something in the environment, interpreting it as threatening. And our nervous system is not particularly smart. It goes back to this old circuitry that we've had for the last 50, 60,000 years. And as a species, I should say. And so it does what it's supposed to do. Something in my environment is stressful. It's alarming. We are alerted to it. So our heart rate and respiration is going to increase. Our blood, so that we can get more blood to our extremities, so we can respond more quickly. Our muscles tense up. We sweat. We tend to experience shortness of breath because we're trying to respirate more frequently. And afterwards, we feel absolutely fatigued, worn out, feel irritable potentially. And so this system is what kept our ancestors alive long enough to reproduce and become our ancestors. So unfortunately, the system is largely inappropriate to the things we experience on a daily basis for most people. Certainly some segments of our population live in more acutely life-threatening situations than the rest of us do. And so I do want to acknowledge that. But by and large, getting called into your boss's office because you're late to work, or not doing as well as you would like on a test, typically are not life-threatening emergencies, but your brain still interprets them as such. So getting cut off in traffic, recognizing that your money may be tight next month, having a fight with your significant other, your romantic partner, missing a deadline. These are all things that can trigger these kinds of anxiety and fear responses in us. So when we feel these, we experience stress, and stress is the fallout from these anxiety producing experiences that we have. And so it's normal. It's normal to feel stressed in stressful situations. And so we typically feel stress when we are faced with multiple competing demands on our attention and efforts, both of which are limited. None of us have infinite amounts of attention. In fact, there's a very large body of literature about attentional resources in human beings, but we do know that eventually you do cap out in your ability to attend to and respond to demands in your environment. Some people have a little bit more capacity than others, but ultimately we all eventually just run out of steam, for lack of a better term. And so on average, most Americans report experiencing a significant amount of stress. 30% of Americans on an average year, experience reporting very high levels of stress in their daily lives. And the caveat to this is that stress is a relative experience. Not some people, one person might be experiencing the same kinds of things that another person is, and they may not consider it very stressful, but the other person it considers it very stressful. So stress is both objective, something you can objectively look at, but also you have to understand the subjective experience of the person experiencing it. Now in the COVID-19 era, so it's interesting that we still call this COVID-19, but here in 2022, we're still experiencing it, still coming on. A lot of things we've noticed about the people in the United States. 2/3 of Americans have report that since the beginning of COVID-19, they've experienced unwanted changes in their weight. They're experiencing changes in their sleeping patterns. I know I have personally. I've gained and lost weight that I didn't particularly want to. My sleeping patterns have changed. Half of Americans have reported putting off necessary healthcare services, especially preventative healthcare. 50% of parents report that there's lots of extra stress due to childcare. So getting healthcare for the kids, remote learning in a lot of cases, behavioral issues that come with all those kinds of disruptions, and essential workers like, say, mental health workers or healthcare workers, people who work in hospitals, ERs, are 3 times more likely to have been diagnosed with a mental illness over this time. And about 1/4 of Americans report that they or a member of their household has experienced job loss during the pandemic. And so nearly 50%, I think that's a low estimate, of Americans report that their stress level has increased significantly since the beginning of the COVID-19 period. And so because this is a pandemic, life has been disrupted for everyone across the world, especially us here, not especially us, but definitely us here in the United States. So might want to ask, how do I know if I'm having a problem with stress? And again, stress itself is one of those predicting factors for ultimately suicide risk, but stress doesn't feel good. So you may be having difficulty with stress if you change a lot of your behaviors to accommodate for it. So you may ask yourself, have I been drinking too much alcohol or more alcohol than normal? Am I talking excessively? Am I not giving myself a moment to breathe, to process the kind of things that I'm saying or the things that people are saying to me? Am I getting worked up or being more irritable? Am I worrying more? Do I feel the necessity to constantly check emails or take phone calls or even check social media a lot too? I mean, it can be a lot easier for us to get pulled into social media just because it is an immediate distraction. Really, even on a neurological level, social media triggers the same kinds of neural circuitry that we see in rewards, and that you might even see with gambling, because you don't know what you're going to find when you log into Instagram. You might see what your feed looks like. So do we find that it's easier for us to become agitated or aggravated at things that normally either brought joy or were neutral to us? And this is something that a lot of us are facing right now. Do we feel like we're overwhelmed? Do we feel that even though we're doing the same job we were before, are we feeling unproductive or even overproductive? One of the things that we've noticed now is that with so much virtual work, it's a lot easier for us to go from meeting to meeting to meeting, class to class to class, without any intervention in between. So this is one of the things I noticed early on too, is that I think over the COVID period, I've become more productive, but there's no processing time. It's just jumping from one task to the next to the next. And I know a lot of people who work remotely, a lot of folks who have to attend classes and do remote learning feel the same way. So some of the triggers that some of the things that can trigger stress responses in people, obviously, job and school pressures, relationship problems, having issues with finances that may be related to job and relationship issues, just the overall increase in daily demands of our attention and our effort, having to commute from one place to another, being overcommitted, having to manage childcare, dependent care. So even folks who are caregivers for older adults or individuals who are experiencing disabilities may cause extreme stress. So as I said before, stress is a very individual experience for a lot of folks. And so how do we feel it? We feel it physically. We feel it with the presence of extra headaches, gastrointestinal issues, just getting sick more often, having the aforementioned trouble sleeping, more muscle tension, aches, pains, etc. So if we can experience it physically, We can experience it emotionally, in that we experience more anxiety, worry, more restlessness, even anger. We don't typically think of anger as being something that's associated with depression or anxiety, but anger is an exceptionally effective emotion at provoking a response in the environment around you. If you get irritated with someone and you start yelling at them behind the counter of the grocery store, they will respond very quickly because they're trying to figure out what to do to make you go away from them. So, but anger is often the last tool in our toolbox when we start running out of coping strategies. So these feelings of insecurity can trigger depression, sadness, anger, and even things like lack of focus or forgetfulness, in which all of these things together typically, sometimes we call it burnout. And burnout's a kind of ill-defined term in a lot of practical situations, but that's really the best way to describe it. And finally, we can also manifest these symptoms in changes our behavior, either eating more or less than usual, maybe not having an appetite, or eating more than you would because it makes you feel better. As I've mentioned, those angry outbursts can be a result too. Changes in drug or alcohol use. Having a couple beers a week is not a big deal, unless you have, unless there are some mitigating circumstances. But someone going from having a couple alcoholic drinks a week to maybe now they're drinking an entire fifth of Jack Daniels on the weekend just to relax, or maybe there starts to be interference with their works or with their work, relationships, or classes. These are things that kind of put us on alert as mental health professionals, saying that something has happened. People tend to keep doing the same things, engage in the same routines, unless something acts on them externally. So obviously we might pull back. We might feel like we can't handle social interaction, even though it may be very helpful for us. If you notice you're crying more or even less as well. So what we're really looking here for is major changes in your regular routines, the major changes in your regular behaviors that you would normally see. And so with all this stuff that we've talked about, you may ask, what are some of the healthy ways to cope with stress? So big things that we recommend, that we see that the Centers for Disease Control are recommending, are actually taking breaks from the media, even taking breaks from things like social media. Watching the news, if you want to get depressed, one of the best ways to do that is watch the news 24/7. We always recommend folks limit your news consumption, even local news now, to just a couple times a day. Try to, if you have your phone with you, just leave it in your pocket, leave it in your purse. Don't keep it on your desk so that it's constantly dinging, alerts are showing up, things coming up. It just kind of it removes your focus from the things you're trying to get done in the moment, and it just makes you worry unnecessarily. Taking care of yourself, and both physically and emotionally. So make sure you're eating right. Fast food once in a while is okay. Having pasta every night is probably not a good idea. My wife is straight up Italian, and so pasta is a big part of our diet, but we don't eat it every night. We try to limit our intake. Get a lot of leafy vegetables. Try to get good exercise. Try to get good sleep. I always try to recommend to folks that if you're not getting good sleep, everything in your life is going to hurt more. It's going to feel worse. So try to make sure you get enough sleep if at all possible. Set aside time, even if you have to schedule it, for your own relaxing and your own self-care. I almost hate the term self-care at this point, because it's made so common that no one really, it's almost like we give lip service to it. But really what it is taking care of yourself. And so schedule your downtime, prioritize it. If you know that you have 2 hours on a Friday evening to watch some TV you want, or do something that is pleasurable or relaxing to you, put that in your schedule. Make sure that everyone knows this is my time. This is my sanctified time that no one can really access. It can be harder with some, especially if you have kids or significant partners or things like that. But try to prioritize that as much as you can. Know who you can reach out to that's a healthy person for you to talk to and connect with. Maybe you don't have to share all your problems. Maybe it's just having somebody to talk to. So examples of this may be good friends, play with your kids, your certain professors, folks that you can trust, people that you can really rely on, and avoiding drugs and alcohol as much as possible. Again, every now and then, a beer is not a big deal. Having a social drink with friends can be good and can be helpful. But if it's getting to the point where you feel like you cannot wait to get home so that you can have that glass of wine or have your beer to unwind, that's probably a sign that says you shouldn't be doing that. because it means you're relying on it more than you need to. Taking care of your physical body, I cannot stress this enough. Again, get plenty of sleep, avoid excessive substance use, keep up with your routine health stuff, go to your doctor. If you know you got a checkup, do it. If you need new glasses, go to the optometrist. Don't keep putting these things off, even though it is very easy to do so. And I say that myself as having gotten an eye exam back in December, and I still haven't gone to get new glasses because I haven't been able to find time. Just to kind of show we're all subject to this. But manage yourself, try to keep yourself as healthy as you can. And that is one of the first things that we tell anybody, regardless of why they're coming in the door for us, is to mind your physical well-being. And obviously, if you're having problems, you're thinking about suicide, recognize when you have help. Anytime you realize that you're struggling more than you feel like you can manage on your own, reach out for help. There is help available. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, 1-800-273-8255. If you go to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, you can also receive texts at 838-255. There's online chats available as well. And I have a slide with some resources at the end that Dr. Griffin can make available for everyone if she'd like. But if you're at the workplace, if you're in class, if you have a break, take that break. Don't work through lunch. I'm one of the worst people in the world about this, but I'm getting a lot better to actually go outside, sit at a bench and eat my little TV dinner or eat the lunch I brought from home. But always, if you have a break, take it. Don't try to work through. I know we in our culture, we like to glorify the idea of being the hard worker, but that time you will never get back, and you are owed your breaks. You are owed that time, so you should take them. Try to look into deep breathing exercises, muscle relaxation exercises, mindfulness exercises that you can find. You can just Google any of those terms and find, or you can go on YouTube and find examples of how to step-by-step of how to do this. Chair yoga is a thing too if you don't have a lot of space. But really, time management can help too. Making lists. If it's making you more nervous, then don't do it, obviously. But help set realistic goals, prioritize the things that are important, and protect your own time, because that time is the only currency with any value in our lives. So make sure that you protect what you have. And some of the resources that can help you, Midlands Tech Counseling Center, they have a counseling center we can help in a lot of different ways. And that number is here, 803-738-8324. The University of South Carolina actually has a free or low-cost therapy resource, the University of South Carolina Psychological Services Center. It's out on Elmwood now. They moved it. And it's a beautiful facility too. If you don't feel comfortable going to talking to someone at Midlands Tech, just because there might be people you see all the time, you might investigate that. South Carolina Department of Mental Health also has counseling available too at free or reduced cost. And as I said, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is available 24/7, as is the Veterans Crisis Line if you have prior military service. They're both the same number. You just press 1 if you want to get to the Veterans Crisis Line. And so I realized I spoke very quickly, and I hope I was articulate. But I'm going to open it up to any questions if anyone has, and I'm going to hand it back over to the good folks at Midlands Tech.
Thank you so much, Dr. Warren. We really appreciate you being here this afternoon, and that was a fantastic overview. We enjoyed it very much. So join me, those of you who are here with us live, in thanking Dr. Warren as well. All right, so we have some folks who are headed to another session, but I want to make sure we can get to some questions for those who do want to stay with us that are part of our virtual audience and here live. So please, if you have questions that you'd like to share in the chat with Dr. Cooper and Dr. Warren or both, or if you're here live and would like to share that, I have some as well here that we've received from students. Please go ahead. Let's see.
Question. But how do you respond to someone who says they are just feeling overwhelmed and they just don't think they can deal with it anymore?
Okay, I missed the last part of that. Angela, could you help?
Sure. So how do you respond to someone who feels like they're overwhelmed and just can't do it anymore? It's just sort of out of steam. How do we respond to that person and support them?
So that is a great question. And that's not an uncommon concern for a lot of folks. The first thing I would do is just validate their emotion, validate where they're coming from, and recognize that whether or not you agree with them, looking at their subjective experiences, that's on them. What they think is most valid is what is most valid to them. So just meet them where they are. Really let them know, say, I understand, I am so sorry. It seems like you're really having a hard time with this. Do you want to just maybe sit down and just talk over what is going on? Talk to me about it. Be there for them in the moment. It's probably the most valuable thing that you can do. Folks, everyone's cutoffs for where they just can't cope anymore are different. And so being there for them in the moment, meeting them where they are, is really the first start. And once they realize you're a safe person that they can talk to, that they can kind of express what's going on with them, then you're going to find they're going to open up about specific needs. And so you may not be in the position to meet some or all or any of those needs for that matter. If they're having trouble with finances, it's not your responsibility to subsidize their life, but maybe coming up with some problem solving. But that's good. But the most important thing is letting them be heard. It's so valuable for a lot of people just to be heard and to have people recognize that they're not alone in all of this. Your own ability to empathize with them and say, I've been through some kind of similar things, not what you're going through, but I can understand kind of where you're coming from. And on the other side of that, they may be going through things that you have no reference for, things that involve profound loss or chronic illness or any of those kind of things. And so being careful to, not to say, I know where you're coming from when you really don't have that kind of personal experience. But in those situations, be honest, say that, yeah, this is really hard for you. And I can't imagine what it's like to be in your situation. However, I'm here for you. Let me know how I can help. Or if you just want to talk, let's go down to the student center and get a cup of coffee. Just if you want to just kind of check out for a minute, I'm ready to do that with you. So really, it's just about being there. And I know that sounds kind of hackneyed, but from my position as a practicing clinical psychologist here on the ground, in the field, I can tell you that's one of the most valuable things that you can do for someone or ask for from someone else.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Yes, another thank you. Certainly, absolutely. We've got another question from the audience. And then Dr. Cooper, if you'd like to add to that as well. We've got the questions coming in quick, but we're going to turn it over to one of our audience members.
Well, I don't speak English very good, so my question is how to get however they're thinking of getting revenge, and another question is how to convince someone to stop being with somebody who is toxic in their life, like is a bad person for their life. How to convince that person to get over that person and to move on.
Ooh, that is always a challenge there too, because from our perspective, a lot of times from our perspectives, we'll see people that we care about, and we see that they may not be making wise choices either in their behavior or their associations for other people, and we may be able to recognize it very clearly, obviously. And I think I'm pretty sure you have one or two people in mind when you're asking that question. That is difficult because ultimately it is that person's choice to move out of a toxic or an unpleasant situation. You can make yourself available to that person. And kind of like what I was mentioning before, that just being there for them and letting them know that you are a consistent resource for them is really valuable. Letting them know, trying to talk someone into or out of bad choices is always going to be, you're going to have various levels of success, but they're usually not going to be too good. It's not, because at this point they are attached, it's part of their identity. So really this is a long game, letting them know that you're available. Obviously, if there's any kind of physical violence, if there's any kind of abuse going on, then that escalates things a little bit more. And at that point, you might want to be a little more firm with them, say, listen, this is not healthy. These are the things that I see are going on. I'm here to help in whatever way I can, and offer them resources too. If there's some kind of physical or sexual abuse going on, Sexual Trauma Services of the Midlands is an awesome resource. The South Carolina Domestic Violence Administration is a great, I can't remember Scott Vasa, I can't remember the full acronym. It's another great resource. Even just simple things like, again, saying, I think you need to talk to somebody professionally, just see what's going on. But ultimately, it is their choice. It's, you can't control them. And it is very frustrating if you care about somebody and you care about somebody very deeply, to see them making the same kind of choices that aren't healthy for them. Dr. Cooper, did you have anything to add to that question too?
I mean, I was going to say, is that it's hard to be a person supporting someone who might not be making decisions that are the best for them in the short or the long term, right? And, there are various ways that you can approach it. I've remember instances of people sort of saying is that, they, have never been alone if they, and they don't know how to be alone or single. And, that's just one example, but that's a coping to something. And so sometimes that leads to other realizations about why people continue to be in not just, romantic or dating relationships, but even friendships, right? So I can, I think we probably can think about, at least one friendship example that, has this, that's similar. And so I would say is no, you can, sometimes this is, you can voice your thoughts, you can provide resources. There are moments, that I can even remember where, I've said, well, this is probably not the best, And as a psychologist, it was hard because you sit on a lot of resources and knowledge about like what this ultimately could mean. But I also had to come to the realization that I could provide support, I could voice my thinking, my thoughts, but ultimately I could support them. But sometimes that support, for example, sometimes people come back to you, a year later, or, what you said stuck with me. I didn't listen in the beginning, but I heard it, And so it's almost like, with parenting and kids is that your children don't often hear what you say in the moment, but a year later, a month later, they're like, yeah, I remember what you said. And so, it gets in there. It just doesn't always make its way out in the same way. And, sometimes that happens with our, social relationships and friends. So.
Thank you.
Thank you for great questions and great helpful responses. We've got a couple of chats. We've got time to take just a couple more questions each. And let's see. Oh, wonderful. Thank you for sharing those resources, Dr. Warren. So back to you, Dr. Cooper. Got a lot of students who've been wondering, what are your top parenting tips? Best parents out. What would you share as your best stuff if you could? With
top parenting tips.
Yeah, one or two, maybe. Right? We don't have all day, but one or two.
So the top, I think that some of this is, the one that I would say is, see your children as they are, right? Listen to your children. And I think we often, I can, think about, interactions where sometimes, our kids they're who they are, right? And we parent based upon their strengths, and we have to see them to address and meet their needs appropriately. So that's one, right? So, acknowledge who your kids are and their strengths. And then also, I think another parenting tip is that sometimes the reality is that sometimes we don't always get it right. Like, you know what I mean? Like, parenting is not always 100%, and that's okay. I think our response and our reaction and how we address those challenges is really, really important. And it also models that for children, right? Is that sometimes we don't always get it right in the first pass, right? But then we realize that and we revise, retool, and that is a coping strategy, right? So if you get a D on your test, right? Yes, you're upset, for example, but then that means that you have to retool. Does it mean you're going to study harder or study differently, right? And that sometimes our ability to respond to those challenges is an important thing to model for parents. So knowing that Sometimes things aren't always 100% perfect. That's okay. Sometimes our response and our reaction and our ability to respond to that tells the tale of whether or not children hear us or we are fostering well-being for them.
Fantastic advice, Dr. Cooper. Thank you so much. Let's see, we've got just one or two more. I'm not sure, Dr. Warren, if you saw in the chat, tips for helping veterans cope with additional school and home stress.
So in addition to the things that we talked about in the presentation, I mean, veterans do have their own unique sets of concerns. Veterans on no matter what branch of service that a veteran was in, no matter what their MOS or their job was while they were in, veterans have experienced fairly unique sets of circumstances. Doesn't necessarily have to have been combat, doesn't have to have been anything really that we would consider overly traumatic, but just being part of the active duty military is a stressful experience. And unfortunately experiencing that level of stress, a lot of folks do struggle while they're in service. And again, additionally, unfortunately, it can be a very difficult place for someone to reach out to get help while they're in active duty. And so unfortunately, what happens is they'll do their time, they'll struggle, they'll suffer with their difficulties, and then they'll get out, and then they still hold with them that reticence to seek help. Because while they're active duty, they may have thought, well, if I seek help, if I go to the medical center to try to let them know I'm feeling depressed or anxious or any of this kind of stuff, well, that might hurt my career, or I might get held back in promotions, or I might even get kicked out for medical separation. And so one of the biggest tips is to let them know that services do exist for them. And I'm not particularly territorial, but I do think that the Department of Veterans Affairs, like, this is our bread and butter, is helping veterans get the help they need to be as successful in their lives as they want to be. So I would recommend any veteran who is struggling right now to get registered with the Department of Veterans Affairs. We have 7 outpatient clinics plus our main facility throughout the state, plus at least in our catchment area alone, and there's 7 more along the coast, along to Charleston. People are no more than 30-40 minutes away from a VA clinic anywhere in the state. And we also now do universally, we do video and phone counseling and therapy if we want, if the veteran wants to. As I said, the Veterans Crisis Line is available 24/7. But I would encourage them to get connected. And if they are connected with the VA, they're going to have at very least a primary care provider. Tell the primary care provider, encourage them to talk to their primary care provider about getting engaged with behavioral health. We have embedded behavioral health in our primary care clinics. And so if someone wants, and if they're just feeling garden variety anxiety, stress, difficulty coping, difficulty adjusting to things like the transition from active duty to civilian life, then our primary care mental health teams can handle those kind of issues very easily. And in fact, the first point of contact for most people, this is not just veterans, but everybody, when they're experiencing mental health issues, is actually their primary care provider, followed closely by clergy. Psychologists, social workers, we're way down on the list in terms of people who are reached out to first when someone's really struggling. So encourage them to reach out for help and to get registered with the VA, because we don't just do counseling, we don't just do primary care. And I want to kind of echo back to one of my first assumptions here with preventing suicide, is that suicide is about a restriction of the perception of options available to you to cope. And so one thing that the VA is really good at doing is providing a huge number of resources all over the place. So if someone comes in and they just need garden variety medical care, we can do that. If someone needs specialty care, so optometry, podiatry, prosthetics, TBI, you name it, we can get that. From a behavioral health perspective, we can help with homelessness, job training, serious persistent mental illness help, PTSD, psychotic disorders, inpatient care, outpatient. Someone comes in any one service and they've mentioned that they need help in another service, those referrals can be placed right then and there. And so, and honestly, I have no problem with providing My personal contact information here at the VA, which I'll actually put in the chat right now, because I have poor boundaries, but that's okay. That's my direct extension here at the VA. And so if you're ever really concerned about somebody on a personal level that you think they might be at danger of hurting themselves or someone else, obviously you can reach out to me, but I would encourage you to reach out to the Veterans Crisis Line directly, because what's going to happen is the crisis line will respond right then and there to the level appropriate, and they will let my team here at the VA know what's going on and ask us to follow up. Or they may give you the contact information from people here at my team and say, yeah, this is something that may not be emergent right now, but reach out to Dr. Warren's team at the VA and we'll see how we can get the person engaged. So that's a long answer to a short question, but I would say start with the general tips that are included in the presentation I gave, but never hesitate to reach out for help if you think if something is really dangerous. And that assessment would be not just suicidal ideation is always serious, but if someone looks like they're focusing on death and dying, if it looks like they've worked out a plan or even prepared, practiced, people think, well, holding an unloaded gun to their head, is that really a suicide attempt? We consider that, yes, we consider that preparatory behavior. So that's extremely serious. So anytime you see something like that, then reach out for really serious help through either the crisis line or 911, even for that matter, to figure out kind of what the best way to proceed would be.
Much appreciated, Dr. Warren. Last one for Dr. Cooper, please. And thank you all so much for hanging in here with us and answering so many great questions and sharing such valuable information with our audiences today. Dr. Cooper, what's something that you wish everyone knew about fathering or fatherhood?
Oh, that's a long question. So I think, so I will say that, I've done a lot of work with fathers, and the one thing that fathers often talk about, and it's really stressful for them, is that people often don't view them or see them as equal parents, right? So regardless of whether or not they live with their child or live in the home or outside of the home, is that people speak through others to them, and also, and for example, if their child is sick, they'll call mom versus dad, and we know, and likely folks in the room know that dads are just as good of, like, they're parents in the same way. And as part of that broader discussion, a lot of our fathers talk about the absence of support that speak to fathers, and a lot of those supports being for when their children are younger, so like infants and early childhood. And our fathers talk with us often about when their kids are adolescents and come home with very complicated problems, and reflecting the complexity of how growing up is today, is that they wish they had supports that really spoke to being a father, but also the reality in which they're children, right? And so sometimes, those who are parents in the room know that sometimes something happens to your child and it reminds you of something that happened to you, right? So, it could be, them being bullied, you also being bullied, them experiencing something, and it sends you back to how you felt in that moment. And a lot of our fathers often talk about needing supports to really deal with some of those things, right? And so, so I think, there are many things I could say about fathers, but I think that, speaking to fathers in the same way that we speak to mothers, right? And also thinking about how we meet the needs of fathers in our services, whether those are organizations or other things that are directed to parents, but also speaking to the needs of fathers in the same ways in which we do so for mothers, right? So our fathers say, no one ever asked me about being a father, right? A woman can go to the hair salon, the movies, and not want to talk about parenting for the next 2 hours, and the first thing out of someone's mouth is, hey, how are the kids? Right? We don't do that as much for men, and sometimes they desire that discussion and that exchange around, how's parenting going?
Well, so much wonderful advice today. Thank you so much, Dr. Shauna Cooper, Dr. Peter Warren. We really appreciate your time, your expertise, your sharing, and have all benefited so much together today with you. So thank you for being here. We're going to wrap up here, and I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. Thanks for being part of Get Psyched with MTC 2022.